So what we wound up doing was sending targeting commands to both of the little mini squadrons that were isolated, and then doing some other stuff to alphas by radio, all at the same time. And our squadron commander called, I was working with Phil McLean, and I was a deputy. And our squadron commander called out and said, how are you doing this? And I explained what we were doing. And Colonel Nichols, who was one of the tech guys from the Minuteman Development Program, said, when you come back tomorrow, explain it to me again. He didn't say don't do it. He just said, I want to see you explain this to me on paper. But nothing was on fire. Nothing broke. And when we got home, we explained what we had done. And the key thing that we had done is meet revision change. Because come hell or high water, at a specified date and time, you had to be ready to do it.
Right.
And we made our rev change time by about an hour and a half. Had we not done that, I think the wing commander would have lost his job. You know, it's that serious an event.
Right.
And we went home, and we got the tapes out, and we explained to him what we did. And then he brought in the ops officer. We told him. And other people came through, and it really was kind of fun. You know, it's almost like outlining a football game. You know, we did this play and this play and this play, and it worked.
Right.
And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You know, that's one alert that stands out.
Mm-hmm.
We put the key in once, but you know, that was a different sort of thing. It was the longest 8 or 9 minutes of my life. And we took the keys out. You know, we never had a serious emergency. I know we had one night, we had a couple of cops go out, and this was a learning moment. We had a couple of cops that wanted to go check a launcher, and we had a storm coming. And I called home to base and said, when's the storm going to be here? And the young airman on the base gave me a time. Well, I didn't know it, but this was this young airman in the weather office. This was his first time all by himself. And he gave me the time the storm was going to hit the base, not when it was going to hit Charlie. So we sent the cops out, and about half an hour, 40 minutes later, we get hit by just a massive storm. And we can't get a hold of the cops on the radio. And I'm convinced that they put themselves into a ditch and they'd have died. A few minutes later, while we're trying to find them and everybody's on the radio and on the phone, I get a call over our Heart and Voice channel here from a Delta crew. John, are you missing a couple of cops? Yes. Well, we found them. Turns out they had found a launcher. They were in the storm and they figured we can't get home. They found a launcher, went in and went downstairs to the equipment building and fired up the diesel to generate some heat so they don't freeze to death. And we did all sorts of phone patches and everybody authenticated. And Omaha was in because it was unauthorized entry. It was an alarm situation 4. And it became apparent that these guys were just going to have to wait until we could get them out. And they'd get them out the next day. And we had the chief of security police on the phone. And when everybody was hanging up, he was still there. I said, you know, Colonel, it's my fault. I said they could go. You know, if anybody deserves to get smacked, I'm the one. And the commander of the cops, I can't remember his name, said, what are you worried about? I think they did something smart. Don't you, Lieutenant? And I thought for just an instant, and I thought, the way he said that, I think it means he's not mad. I said, yes, sir, I think it was the smartest thing they could have done. He said, well, it's the smartest thing they could have done. I don't have a problem with it. Good night, Lieutenant. And that was that. But it was a tremendous learning moment for me. Because I really thought I had screwed up, and I was not going to let these kids hang, because I'm the one who said they could go. And this colonel, I think much to his credit, understood that, yeah, I was a lieutenant out here, and then I had these cops, and I was worried about them. And, you know, they did the smart thing. You didn't know any better. What more can we do? And it was a learning moment. I learned that, yeah, I could make a decision. And yeah, if what everybody does is reasonable under the circumstances, maybe we don't need to get all that excited.
Right.
And it was a tremendous learning moment for me as a second lieutenant. And it had application, for the next 20 plus years because I stayed in the Air Force Reserve.
What else do you think you took with you from the missile field into the rest of your career, even up to now, your days as a lawyer?
Well, one of those, do what you think is right. If somebody does something that they think is right and they're reasonable about it, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback, but that doesn't help them get the job done, and it doesn't help them learn or grow. It doesn't help a young lawyer if a partner jumps down his throat about something. What you say is, okay, what did you take from this? What did you learn? Because there's really very little in law you can't undo. Clearly, when I was in the Reserve Force as an intelligence officer, I would have occasion to deal with younger officers or airmen in our intel shops. I didn't have to come across as sternly as perhaps our officers did here, because I learned that our enlisted troops, our young officers, are trying very, very, very hard to do the right thing. And we don't gain anything by making them feel bad if they make a mistake. Mm-hmm. We do not profit. What was the phrase? There is no profit in it. Right. We don't come out ahead if we do that.
Do you think some of that was laid with that, getting back to what we were talking about earlier, that kind of like what you learned interacting with the Standing Val guys and that competition where that kind of your young mentality that you'd experienced?
Yeah, I would, and later on, I was an instructor with the Air Force Reserve. I gain nothing by if I'm teaching a class and I got a room full of pilots, I don't gain anything by making the pilot look stupid. What I have to do is convince him that what I am teaching is valuable and that it's worth his time to pay attention to the class. I spent time as an instructor at the Air Force Tactics School out at Nellis in the C-130 side of the house with airlift. My job when I was teaching pilots, I have to convince them that this matters. And it makes me a salesman, which was clearly not at all how it was done here. Yeah, true, I wasn't competing with the pilots, whereas our Standing Val guys and our instructors here were competing with the same people they were instructing. What I did as an intel officer, I think, fit my personality much better.
What'd you do for fun down here? You remember?
You mean fun in the capsule?
Yeah, fun in the capsule. Fun to get through 24 hours, 50 feet below ground.
I read a lot more Sports Illustrated than I read now.
Okay.
Our TVs really did not work very well at all. We did not have VCRs. The habitability improvements they did in '86 are just amazing. It was far more austere. We had a drawer full of paperback books that the Air Force Library Service would send out. Excuse me. I was working on my master's, so I was doing a fair amount of studying out here. There was enough to stay busy.
Right. What about your crew partners? Do you remember any of those guys?
Yeah.
Do you have relationships with some of those guys?
Yeah, I'm in contact with Chuck Birdsall, who was one of my deputies when I first upgraded to commander. I went to Phil McLean's wedding, and I hear from him 2 or 3 times a year.
And he was your...
He was a crew commander of mine.
Okay.
It's interesting. He was a math major from the University of Alabama. Very, very quiet. I'm not a Southern guy. I grew up in Southern California and went to Berkeley. An unlikely pair. But it's interesting. We were crewed together 5 or 6 months, and crews were identified with a letter and a number. For example, they had R crews, which were regular crews, E crews, which were excellent crews, and S crews, which were superior crews. And the standing valve guys and the instructors were all S crews. And the flight commander of the squadron command post was an S crew. Everybody else was a line crew. There were some excellent crews in the squadron command post, but it was sort of an unofficial rating system, an unofficial food chain. And I don't know how they figured this stuff out. But Phil and I worked very well together. I think we took a check ride. We did fine on the check ride. We did well on our tests. We came into work one time, and start of the month, we looked at a schedule, and we were S-34. We had been rated one of the superior crews, and we were the only S-rated line crew on SAC, because the bombers and the tankers used the same scheme.
Okay.
But we were the only S crew that pulled 8 alerts a month. And I'm 6'1". Phil might be 5'8", looks a little bit like an owl, and we were very much a Mutt and Jeff kind of team. But we worked very well together.
Was he your first commander, or your?
No. I worked with Phil at Charlie when I moved to Squadron Command Post.
Okay.
I had a crew partner named Steve DiGiacomo, and when we would check in, they'd call roll, and I worked with Steve when I was at Charlie as commander. The crew of Giselius and DiGiacomo, and they called us the Alphabet Crew. And I think he's a psychologist now in Pennsylvania or something like that, because he's left the Air Force.
Okay.
So I'm still in contact with a few of them.
Yeah. We talked a little bit earlier about that importance of your first commander, and kind of. Can you talk about that again, or?
Yeah, my first commander was a guy named Mark Halsdorf, and Mark was a graduate at Texas Tech. Tall, lanky guy. And, he had one way of pulling alert, and and I think I was his first deputy after he upgraded, or one of the first ones. And I could pull alert with him, but we did not work well together. There were things that people knew about Mark, or perceived about Mark, and how he did the job down here. That through just transference, well, if you work with Mark, you must do this too. And I didn't. So there, I worked with Mark 5 or 6 months, and then I was recruited with a guy named Denny Nichols. And Denny was a prior enlisted guy, salt and pepper hair, that rumor had was difficult to work with. But I found him to be a very nice guy, good at what he did, prior enlisted, so he knew how to handle the maintenance troops and the guys upstairs. And it was very useful for me to have him as a commander, because that's where I learned how to manage and how to deal with the maintenance troops we had out on site, how to deal with folks here. It greatly increased my comfort level down here. Because with Mark, I was never really quite sure how I was doing. With Denny, there was no question. If you made a mistake, he would let you know. But he would not let you go so far that you made it. No clue what Denny is doing now. And I had a lot of crew partners that were prior enlisted. Denny Nichols was prior enlisted, Theron Brown was prior, Chuck Birdsall was prior. I had a deputy, and I can't think of his name. I want to say Jim Schultz, but that's not it. He was prior enlisted. And I got along really well with those guys.
It definitely seems to be something that we don't talk about very much, or, at least for the historical record. And I think there's a lot more importance in that crew member relationship, who you're crewed with, than I think the only way we can get it is through oral histories. And that's not written down anywhere. And so I do like to talk about that, the importance that a crew commander has over a deputy. You know, even very early on, especially that reputation building that you talked about, it can have a
Absolutely.
very significant impact
Absolutely.
on the crew member.
You know, you could work with anybody in the wing, and I had a deputy for only 5 alerts. His name was Mike Clements. Again, a prior enlisted guy. Was a master sergeant who got a commission, and he developed a back issue. And after 5 alerts, he was permanently DNIA. And I was the designated spare commander for the squadron. And for 4 or 5 months, I worked with anybody and everybody that was available. You know, where am I going to go to? Where do I go to work today, and who do I go to work with? You know, and I pulled splits with guys from the 47th and 48th and wandered all over the wind. Maybe how I got here, because I did pull alert at all 15. So you could work with anybody, but you really wanted to work with the same guy, because you would figure out if they read the clock properly. You know, how good were they at status monitoring? Could they read the clock? Do they have a particular strong point in emergency war operations, or do they know weapon system well? You know, you could become much more comfortable always working with the same guy.
And then that carries over into the simulator as well.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Absolutely.
I mean, like we were talking earlier, that bit of acting, it's always good to know your acting partner, so to speak.
Yes.
If you want to go that far.
Yeah, because then you know if the reaction is real or if it's not.
Right. We were talking on the way down here about your family tour.